Welcome to Everyday Greatness, a nice little show proudly brought to you by major sponsor ARA Group, one of Australia's greatest supporters of community projects. Everyday Greatness is a show hosted by a real human being, talking to some real people about real human issues that will help make you feel proud again of simply being a good solid Joe bag of donuts. Here's your host, Barnaby Howarth.
Welcome to Everyday Greatness, and thanks for listening. I'm your host, Barnaby Howarth. This is a show designed to help people realise there is greatness in being in everyday Harry Sacker roles. We're recording our podcast today inside Let's Go Planet, thanks to Vince, who's bailed us out from a last-minute crisis. So thank you, Vince. Because family resilience is built by the accumulation of small acts of love over a lifetime, the children of my cousin, Prue and Eric Clarke de Cavaignac, will be amongst the most resilient people in world history. Prue has seen some of the darkest parts of humanity. A fearless journalist, Prue has reported on the Twin Towers bombings on 9/11, the Ebola crisis in Africa, post-tsunami Aceh in Indonesia, indigenous communities and asylum seekers in Australia, and war criminals in exile in the US and Europe. Prue is the founder and executive director of New Narratives, a group that gives voice to reporters in low-resource countries to find new ways to bring quality journalism to all people. PRUE CLARKE is a woman smashing through the glass ceiling. She's reported from 6 continents for groups such as The Washington Post, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, Guardian, and ABC Australia. She's moderated panels for the World Health Organization and the United Nations General Assembly. But at the heart of it all, PRUE CLARKE is just a country girl. She grew up in the small New South Wales mid-north coast town of Wingham. But today, PRUE CLARKE is the ultimate contradiction of a human being. On the surface, she's a high-flying corporate success story. But you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. Prue is just trying to be the best mother and wife she can be. And she's holding on to that old-school country pursuit of just trying to be a good person. It's my privilege to say that PRUE CLARKE joins me now. Prue, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Barnes.
So, you are an old-school country girl at heart. When did you decide that a small-town country girl could help shape the world and become an international journalist?
So thank you so much for having me, Barnes. It's such a pleasure to be with you, who's one of my heroes, and I'm so proud to say my cousin. As you know, I grew up with definitely on a small farm, but also with lots of people in my world who had done amazing things. My grandfather, who was your great uncle, had fought on the Kokoda Trail and, really was an incredible human being. My other grandfather had actually arrived in Australia from Northern Ireland after his father had been murdered in the war that happened in Northern Ireland in 1920, and he was 14. And then my mother had spent a lot of time overseas. So there was a lot of time spent on overseas, this place overseas when I was growing up. So I was always very aware that there was a big world out there and I really wanted to see it. And I remember one of my earliest memories was my mother flying me in a plane for the first time in my life from Taree to Sydney when I was about 9 or 10, and we stayed on Oxford Street and stayed in a motel there. And I sat up all night looking at the streets and going, oh, wow, this city's so amazing. Which, I look back now, having lived in New York for many years and, chuckle at the naive Prue that was. But there was certainly, that really big desire to see the world even then.
So every young journalist wants to report on a story that shapes history. You were thrown into that opportunity when the Twin Towers bombings happened and you happened to be in New York. Are you thankful for that situation, that you got to report on that, or in hindsight, would you rather not?
It's a good question. I remember, growing up, I was always fascinated by those big events in world history, like the Titanic and the Hindenburg disaster, and I so wanted to be there to see those things, and suddenly there I was. And I remember calling into the newsroom that morning, and there was a young journalist there. So it was morning for me, but even really late at night. And there's a young journalist there. You might know of his name. He's gone on to get a bit of a bigger reputation. His name's Raphael Epstein. And Rafi was 1 year ahead of me at the time. So we were both sort of, 20, in our 20s. And he was like, "You're so lucky to be there." And I had just about died, an hour before that, and seen a lot of horrors, a lot of people falling out of the building. And I was really struggling to process it, especially as a young, fairly privileged Australian who had not really been exposed to any horrors before that. And I knew what he meant. But at the time, it didn't feel like I felt very lucky to be there. But it certainly plunged me on a path to understand the world better that I was already on. It just gave me a big kick down the track. And look, it was really hard. It really knocked me for six. It was a lot of PTSD, but I absolutely I would be there every time if given another chance. It's such a privilege that comes with this job, to be on the front lines, to see those moments, to live that history, to talk to the people who've been through it, experienced it, and I wouldn't turn it down again, ever.
So you were thrown back onto the front lines when the BBC asked you to report on the Ebola crisis in Africa. You had a young family at that stage. Were you scared going into that front line, or were you thankful?
So, just to give a little bit of background there, after 9/11, I'd taken myself off to work with journalists and report around the world, as you outlined. And so I'd been working in Africa for about 10 years before that. And I had also set up, and we were going to talk about the non-profit newsroom that I'd set up, and it was based in Liberia, which was one of the hardest hit areas of the three countries. In fact, by about July of that year, so 3 months into the crisis, Liberia was hundreds of new cases a day, and it was really terrifying. So I actually persuaded the BBC to go, and we had big teams in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, but we didn't have anybody in Liberia. And I had been working with a lot of great journalists there for a long time, and I knew they were terrified, and I was terrified for them. So I actually persuaded them to set up a radio program in the country and to spread the message of how to avoid getting Ebola. And, it was a real crash course in emergency communications. We did the first WhatsApp programming out of that region. This was 2014. To reach as many people as possible. And also, I think some things that people are learning quickly in this COVID crisis as well, that people don't trust politicians or public health experts so much. They trust the people they know. So it was really when we started speaking to the clergy, to the football stars, to the musicians, and having them spread the messages, that the message really started to get across. So to answer your question about being terrified, I had spent months by that stage really with a lot of public health experts understanding Ebola so that we could spread the facts. And the thing about Ebola, I know it's terrifying. We've all seen the movies, and I had felt the same way. But the amazing thing about Ebola is, though you have a very good chance of dying if you get it, perhaps a 1 in 2 chance, you can't spread it until you are really ill. So when the first telltale signs of Ebola are a low-grade fever and a sore throat, and if you've been exposed to anyone who's violently ill, you've probably got Ebola. So you can then isolate yourself and not infect anybody else. So it's a huge advantage, obviously, over COVID-19. So I was very aware that I was able to go to these places, not expose myself to anybody who was violently ill, and I would be okay. So I was not afraid, but everyone around me was. And during that crisis, I actually lived in London at the beginning, and then I moved to New York, and everyone around me, so my kids' schools, we had a live-in nanny. I had to ask her if she wanted to, move out. And the kids' schools were terrified. At one point, the university I was working in New York had a rule that anyone who'd been in Ebola territories for 30 days before couldn't come into the building. So there was, and I wasn't invited to dinner parties for a good year. So there was a lot of fear, but I think, I did what I do with every terrifying situation. If I have all the facts and feel like I'm in a good position to assess the risk, and then I make a decision to go, I don't feel afraid anymore. And that's how it was with Ebola.
So after reporting on 9/11 and the Ebola crisis, reporting on everyday news stories might have seemed a bit dull for you. What does it mean to you to be able to run new narratives and give back to the world by providing people with a chance to report on really big stories and and give a voice to people who didn't have one previously?
Yeah, so look, it definitely, I think all international correspondents and war correspondents have a hard time coming home and covering council stories. But I must say, I still have a lot of pleasure in doing really in-depth stories that shine a light on things that don't get enough attention. For instance, one of the last stories I did before this breakout of reporting that I've done now is an in-depth look at pediatric cancer treatment in Liberia and Rwanda, two countries that were very similar 20 years ago, and now they've had much different forms of governance. And I tell you, if you had to have cancer as a kid anywhere in Africa, you'd rather be in Rwanda every time than Liberia. So it was a fascinating experience for me to be able to tell that story. But I did spend a lot of time, I think, by the end I'd spent 5 or 6 years reporting, as you say, in these war zones and disaster zones. And I remember having this moment in Congo, in eastern Congo, where they'd had a terrible civil war after the Rwandan genocide, and horrific stories of rape and exploitation and child soldiers. And I'd just done 4 stories, and I'd listened to 4 interviews, 4 stories, and the stories were so dark that some of them I couldn't report, on American radio, which was the program I was doing them for. And also, the other thing was my audiences knew why these things were happening. They knew about the minerals under the people's feet and why people were fighting about them. And my family couldn't listen to these horror stories anymore. And it was just really clear to me that the people who could do something about it were the people that I was reporting on. And they actually had less information than my audiences did about what was happening to them. So I think a lot of reporters have that frustration at some point, and I just thought, when I'm much better off devoting my energies to helping these people report the stories, these journalists. And so, my early 30s, maybe a bit of rush of blood to the head and grandiosity, I decided to set up a non-profit newsroom to work with the leading media houses in Africa to help them tell these stories better to their people. And we've been going for 11 years now. We're at the moment covering war crimes trials around the world. I have, been just the incredible privilege of working with some amazing journalists who's, I think we take democracy for granted a bit here. And so when you work with people who are bringing information to their audiences for the first time, it's so rewarding and such a privilege for me. For example, one story that we did was a really quality, in-depth explanation of what happens in female genital cutting in countries where, that had never been done in those countries. So the traditional leaders who practice it and make have their status and income derived from practicing this were very angry, and our reporter had to go into hiding, and it was terrifying. But in the wake of that, a whole lot of people came out to talk about why female genital cutting was bad and harmful to girls long term. And we even started to hear that the girls were hearing about what happened to them, and they hadn't known beforehand anything bad. So it just showed you, once you start a national conversation about some really big societal issue, and you inject facts into that setting, the ball starts rolling and people make change themselves. So it's been a real privilege to be able to do that.
So New Narratives has reported on topics like rape, as you said, female circumcision, child soldiers, child labour, and teen prostitution. You've witnessed some heavy things. How are you?
Well, thanks for asking, Barnes. It's an important question, and it's, I have definitely struggled with PTSD, especially after my first child was born. And I didn't start having children until I was 35, and we thought very hard about whether to have children. But after I had my son, every terrible thing that had happened to a child that I'd reported on, I imagined happening to him. And, in that first year when you're terrified of being a parent, it was really, really hard. And I think, I know now that a lot of war correspondents, when they have their first child, it's almost, that's the end. It's very, very hard to do after that. And so and the other thing is, to walk away, I think people understand that the hardest part is not necessarily hearing the horrific stories. It's the knowing that you could help that person, but you can't. You have to walk away. And because you can't help everybody, and even if you just gave them, some support to get through the next 6 months, what happens after that? You are an observer. You're not part of it. Your role is to bring that story to the international community, and it doesn't feel like enough a lot of the time. And that's the hardest part, is to walk away from people that you could help, but that you can't, and that stays with me a lot. And so the truth is, actually, New Narratives really helped. I think I remember, my PTSD easing the day after we first did some really hard-hitting stories that sparked national conversations in the countries. And I could feel that we were driving systemic change rather than the one-off that it might be momentarily gratifying for me and the person, but it isn't driving the change that I know journalism can have. So, New Narratives has really helped with my PTSD, and I, also I've had therapy, of course, and it's essential to getting a handle on these things.
So let me talk to you about resilience. You were only 27 when you reported on the Twin Towers bombings for the ABC. Then it was only a year after your daughter was born that you reported on the Ebola crisis in Africa. How do you think resilience has been built in your life? Is it by the trauma and the horrors that those traumas represent? Or have you been getting resilience building from the people around you?
It's a combination of all of that. I think I have learnt so much along the way about human nature, about what motivates people. I mean, I remember, I grew up in a very sheltered setting, very, very conservative setting, and was very much told, this is your role in life. Women do this, men do this. And that didn't ever sit very well with me. So, I was out, much more interested in what I could do and what I couldn't do. And so I really spent a lot of time trying to understand humans, how these boxes that we were all putting ourselves in were constructed. And then I'd see these horrors. So the two extremes, my little sheltered life, and then the extremes of the people that I was reporting on. And, it's really helped me get a better understanding of humanity and what motivates us. And I can't tell you, it's such a gift to work so closely with people out of war settings and out of deprivation for so long. I had this photo sitting in front of us. I know it's terrible radio, but it shows a photo. It's probably got 80 really happy-looking Africans. And the thing is that what you don't know about those people is that they're all Ebola survivors. And I took that photo probably half an hour after I had done this gutting interview with a midwife who had lost her entire family after she'd contracted Ebola while doing her job. And she was telling this gutting story. And then, half an hour later, I turned around and she and all of the survivors there who all had similar stories are singing and dancing and praising God. And it was so shocking to me and such an incredible example of resilience. People who had suffered so much all their lives have become incredibly dependent on themselves and confident in their own ability to survive and keep themselves going. And I thought, if they can do it, I need to I need to have that same peace of mind and confidence and commitment. Yes, it was really hard, and I think it taught me that resilience and self-reliance is really critical. So we very much push our children to be independent, probably more so than all the parents around us. So it's, I guess it's a combination of, we all tell these childhoods where we were basically neglected and left to raise ourselves. And now parenting has gone to the other extreme where everyone wraps them in cotton wool. We're somewhere in the middle, I think, where we really do believe they need to learn confidence in themselves and independence and push them out of their comfort zone. And it's so far so good.
Good to hear. So, have the horrors you've witnessed in your life shaped your parenting?
Yeah, look, I said that, we thought very hard about whether we should have children and could we bring what is, a really, really important job. And I think maybe some people don't think too hard about that. So we took it very seriously. We both have had very different lives from our own parents, and so many different experiences, so many different inputs, and definitely we have taken all of our experiences, and because we were older parents, we had a lot of experiences to bring to that parenting. So we definitely have, yeah.
So do you feel like you and your husband are being good role models for your children?
We try. I'm sure that they would. Luca gives us, our 12-year-old gives us ratings regularly, and mostly we get 9 out of 10, which is heartening. We definitely feel the weight of responsibility to be the good humans that we hope that they will be, and that means modelling really strong values of gratitude primarily, equality, inclusion, racial, gender, sexual orientation, every marginalised identity. And we also drench them in history and help them understand why groups have been stigmatised, but also their own background and how they came to be where they are. When they have so many different stories that have contributed to who they are, and we think it's really critical for them to understand that. I work really hard to discourage negativity in them. It's harder here, to be honest. It's easier in the US where the culture is much more positive and can do. But I do work hard to stop those sort of little negative criticisms of each other and other people. I think that's really important. And we very much teach them to be humble. I certainly know the older I get, the less I know. And to love. I know it sounds a bit corny sometimes, but it's critical to really, I think one of the things I've learned is that we are all the same, and we get put into little pots and stirred with all sorts of poison throughout our lives that can make us turn one direction or the other. But I have always had a better reaction from people when I start with love and generosity on the way in. But the other thing I think is to really fight for their place in the world, especially my daughter. I don't want her to be put into boxes that I was put into because of her gender, and I don't want my son to put other people in those boxes. So that's been really important to do.
Do you feel like your children are good people these days?
Yes, I do. And I think, that's really, it's really a relief as a parent. I mean, things could totally go off the rails, but they're 12 and 8, and they're both, they're both very kind, and they strive to be kind to other people. For instance, my daughter, who just turned 8, is, for her birthday, she's feeding 100 kids at a big feast in Liberia on Saturday, kids who don't often get really good meals, and she's really thrilled to be doing that. Look, they're both really big personalities, and they're always working really hard to get what they want, get one over their parents. But I can see that it's baked in that they're good humans, and I think hopefully they'll be okay.
So you said you sit in the middle of the carrot and the stick parenting model.
Yes.
Do you and your husband actively try and build resilience in your children, or you let them fight for themselves?
It's funny. There's a third option that I do see, which is neither. It's sort of protecting them from building resilience. And we, obviously I don't want to put them in risk, but I think coming back to that, where I said to you, I assess all the factors when I'm deciding how afraid to be of something. And once I've come to a decision about how dangerous it is, I go with that, and I'm not afraid anymore. So, for instance, Luca doesn't have a phone, and he catches the bus from the eastern suburbs to his school in the city every day. A couple of times he's got on the wrong bus. And other kids have a phone, and they have, they just pick it up and their parent solves the problem for them. But Luca has a couple of times had to solve the problem for himself. And, I know people are absolutely terrified, understandably. I mean, the terrible things have happened to children. But the chance of that is so incredibly small that I would much rather live my life not dwelling on those fears and forcing him to learn that independence and resilience, learn that he can actually fend for himself in those circumstances. That's more important. That risk is worth it to me. And on top of that, he would be on his phone all day, every day, and we'd never see him again. So to us, that has been really key in helping Luca build his resilience and confidence.
Beautiful. So what sort of mother are you trying to be these days?
It's a good question, and it's hard. It's so hard. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. I had no clue. I am trying to teach them that you can be strong and do what you want, have the impact you want to have in the world, but also be really respectful and compassionate to other people. And I think that I hope I'm providing that, being that role model. Eric and I have, we share parenting duties, we share roles in the house as much as we can. We've shared careers, we've had to move around all over the world to support each other. So they see parents who are both trying to have impact in the world and do good things, while also trying to be really good parents at the same time. And I hope that they grow up to understand that is an option for them, but that they also have to be very practical and understand that the whole you can have it all doesn't necessarily work in the world that we live in right now. There are always sacrifices. But look, I've again weighed my options, and I think there are definitely times when I'm not as good a parent as I would like to be. But at the same time, I've been able to give them opportunities and expose them to the world and show them how you can be passionate and have an impact at the same time. And I think, and especially as a woman, and being an equal, have an equal relationship in parenting. And I hope that is good down the track.
Very nice. So when you have guests around at your house, say you have a dinner party, what do you hope your guests say about you guys, about your family when they leave?
I would love them to say that we're the funniest, most entertaining people that they've ever met, but sadly I don't think they do say that because I tend to be a bit of a worrywart, which probably comes with the job. I have talked endlessly about Donald Trump for the last 5 years, and I'm sure everyone who's left our house has gone, oh my God. Hopefully I never have to talk about Donald Trump with PRUE ever again. But look, I hope that they think that we're, an engaged, caring, loving family, and that our kids are engaged and entertaining. That's my hope.
Well, I can tell you, PRUE Clarke, as a podcast guest, I feel like it's a privilege to have chatted to you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to the ARA Group for major sponsorship of this podcast. Thank you to Let's Go Planet and Vince for helping us out last minute, giving us somewhere to record this podcast. Thank you to Look Studio Australia for recording the podcast. And thank you all for listening. I hope that when you put your devices down in a little while, you lift your head up, push your shoulders back, puff your chest out, and walk down the street proud of being an everyday Joe bag of donuts. I hope you can join us next week when I'll speak to ABC sports journalist and personality Tracy Holmes. I'll be talking to Tracy about how sometimes not winning can be a good thing. Thank you all again for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Everyday Greatness, proudly brought to you by major sponsor ARA Group. If you'd like to stay up to date, check out our pages on Facebook and Instagram, or to listen to more episodes, go to everydaygreatness.com.au or wherever you get your podcasts.